This is a story by Conan the Barbarian creator Robert E. Howard. It is known as Gods of the North, or the Frost Giant's Daughter. I'm going to give it to you, the viewer, so you have a chance to read it in its entirety and form your own opinions on it, because I'm going to spoil it in its entirety. It's not long, only about 10 pages. And I'll even throw in the Dark Horse comic, which is Conan number 2 from March 2004, which doesn't really take any liberties and essentially tells the exact same story graphically. Now, let me catch you up and explain exactly what this video is about and what I'm going to do in it. So I was recently in the middle of a couple of my spare time hobbies, and they just kind of intersected in a funny way. One of them is that I was in the middle of researching for another video I intend to make on the topic of victim blaming. And the other was I was relaxing and rereading one of my favorite comic book series, which happens to be the Dark Horse Conan series. At the end of issue 21, The Prince of Thieves, I noticed this comment from a reader in Australia. Again, I'll let you see it in its entirety, but for the sake of brevity, he complains about a rape that happened in a previous issue and says the comic offended his wife, it offended him, and it offended all women in general. So I'll deal with this guy and his comment in a later video, but anyway, I tried to do some more online research and I stumbled across this article on the website ferretbrain.com. And right there, the tagline over the top caught my attention. It's time to stop making excuses for Robert E. Howard's trashy writing and overt hatred. So again, I'll give you the article in its entirety. It's quite long, but I have no intention of quote mining the author. For brevity though, it is largely a skewering of Robert E. Howard and the stories of the character Conan. It is abundantly clear that the writer of the article doesn't like Conan, doesn't like Howard, and thinks that people who defend Howard are, to put it lightly, mistaken. So now, my own subjective opinion. I am very much a fan of Howard, and especially the Conan stories, though I'll readily admit that the author, Arthur B., far surpasses my knowledge of the subject. Even though I have all of the original stories, I've only read about 2/3 of them. So some of the material covered in the article was new for me, but I was mostly familiar with a lot of it. And feeling opposite of the author's take on it, of course, I disagreed with a lot of what he had to say. Many things that jumped out at me were the glib ways in which the author reduced what I believe to be quite good stories to essentially small phrases or sound bites that didn't really do the author or the stories justice, and one of which was taking the Frost Giant's Daughter, one of the stories I'm very familiar with, and describing it as, Conan tries to rape someone and fails. So yeah. The other thing that really jumped out at me while I was reading it was that there were many examples of the author using feminist keywords and ideas like misogyny or privilege, or in the case of the Frost Giant's Daughter, victim blaming. Now, to be fair to the author, he certainly put in the work to back up his opinions. Again, it is quite a long article, and I do feel that the writer is clearly an intelligent person and states his case competently. And I'll even go so far as to say that I agree with some of his criticisms, including the undeniable element of racism that is a part of Howard's writing. For example, he correctly points out clear racism, like in the Conan story The Veil of Lost Women, where Conan talks to a white woman he saved and says, "You said I was a barbarian, and that is true, Crom be thanked. If you had had men of the outlands guarding you, instead of soft-gutted civilized weaklings, you would not be the slave of a black pig this night. I am Conan, a Cimmerian, and I live by the sword's edge. But I am not such a dog as to leave a white woman in the clutches of a black man." So we're going to come back to this quote later, but for the time being, we're going to award Arthur full points for assessing correctly that racism can be found all over Howard's work. Now, essentially everything I'm telling you now, I let the author know in a comment I posted. So yes, I essentially said that I largely disagree with him, and even though he demonstrated effort and competence in his writing, it came off to me as ludicrously one-sided, which seemed to me to be a byproduct of the influence of feminism. So my comment was responded to by the author and a couple other people, mostly one called Shimin, and we posted back and forth a bit, but I felt it was a bit limiting to express the full weight of my opinion in the relatively short space of a comment thread. So in response to Shimin's request for a more detailed look, and my own desire to give one, you guessed it, this video is that more fully fleshed out response to Arthur's article, an open invitation for the author and any others to jump in the conversation. So, to start things off, about myself. If you've seen any of my other videos, I'm sure it's quite clear to you that I have a large axe to grind with feminism. This might lead you to believe that I'm a men's rights activist, but that's not really true. If there's one theme that runs through my videos, it is using common sense and simple wisdom like a knife to cut through bullshit. What I really don't like is politics itself, which is not to say that I believe in anarchy. I do believe that politics is something of a necessary evil, but an evil nonetheless. More specifically, what I don't like is the mechanics of politics. The truth of life is that it is always dynamic and changing. Sometimes the conservative, cold-hearted, calculated, think-with-your-head answer is the correct answer. And sometimes the liberal, bleeding-heart, tree-hugging, think-with-your-heart answer is the correct answer. The problem with politics itself is that to realistically wield any power, you need to join either Team Red, or Team Blue, or Team Green, and spend your time trying to make the other teams look not only wrong, but astoundingly, idiotically wrong, when in truth, some of their ideas actually make perfect sense. But saying the very human, "You make a good point," or "I was wrong about that," is kind of like political suicide. Politics largely makes you lose the dynamism, the ability to judge situations on an individual level, and therefore the truth of life. To me, feminism is perhaps the very worst, because it occupies a very unique position in the world of politics. Whereas often 2 or 3 major political parties can somewhat keep each other in check, feminism enjoys a position of overwhelming influence, and yet goes virtually unchecked. Have you ever heard of something called masculinism? I haven't. In fact, right now my Microsoft Word spell check is telling me that it isn't a real word. So I was shocked when Wikipedia told me that that actually is a thing. Because as I've seen and met hundreds of feminists in my life, I have never, ever met a masculinist or even seen one on TV. Whoever they are, whatever they fight for, they sure as hell provide no effective check against the influence of feminism. In fact, who does? Who can? If feminists say something factually, categorically wrong, which all humans are bound to do from time to time, who can swat them back down to reality? Well, the short answer is that only women can, and in recent years the men's rights movement has gained a little traction, largely because feminism has become so imbalanced that even women are speaking out against it. A man standing against feminists will typically be drowned under a flood of accusations of misogyny. As a result, feminism, one-sided by its very nature, has grown simultaneously wildly imbalanced and also immensely influential. How influential? Well, when you can make the US president, the most widely known and powerful human on the planet, dance to your tune, no matter how illogical, you know that number 1, you are immensely influential, and number 2, nothing men's rights activists or even masculinists, whatever the hell they are, comes anywhere close to that. Now, of course, it isn't correct to say that just because they're influential, they're wrong. For example, feminists and MRAs often fight back and forth over domestic violence and rape statistics. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, simply put, both. MRAs are right when they say that rape and domestic violence aren't unidirectional, i.e., always male aggressor, female victim. But feminists are right when they say that women make up the majority of those victims. What I'm essentially saying is that when feminists do get it wrong, there is almost no one to hold their feet to the fire and effectively challenge them. What mistakes? What wildly imbalanced ideas? Well, I want to spend more time talking about Conan, so for brevity, I will refer you to my other videos on double standards, privilege, and especially rape culture. But I promise I will cover 1 or 2 in the course of this video. One last thing I'd like to say before I jump into the Conan pool is that I don't rightly know exactly what came first, the chicken or the egg, meaning feminism or political correctness. But I do see them as similarly positioned, i.e. unchallengeable. I think they are mutually influential, and both are a large part of what is wrong with modern society. How exactly? Again, I will cover that in the course of this analysis. Now, with all that said, let's jump into that pool. So, as you had a chance to see, Arthur's article was quite long, so instead of picking apart every sentence I disagreed with, I will be using the section that analyzed the Frost Giant's daughter as number 1, I'm familiar with it, it's actually one of my favorite Conan stories, and number 2, it clearly exemplifies what I think is wrong with Arthur's overall analysis. So by now you should be familiar with the story and have formed your own opinions about it. If not, then briefly, it is about a young Conan and another warrior, the only last 2 men standing after a great battle. Conan dispatches him but takes a blow to the helmet. When he comes to, he's in the presence of Atali, a supernaturally beautiful woman. She mocks Conan and beckons him to follow her, which he does doggedly. She's actually leading him to a trap where her giant brothers come out and attack Conan, who actually succeeds in beating both of them. His blood up, Conan continues to chase the woman, who didn't expect him to survive, and has now had the tables turned on her. His blood racing, Conan is actually trying to rape her, and almost succeeds and grabs her veil. But that's when she calls on her father, the god Ymir, to save her, and he whisks her away. Conan then meets up with his friends, who don't believe his story until the end, when they all notice he is clutching a veil. Now this, in case you didn't read it before, was the author's take on the story. And we can notice that it essentially boils down to two things. One, his criticism for the story centers around one fact and one fact alone, and that is that Conan is definitely trying to rape Atali. And two, because of fact one, this story is completely vile and reprehensible. Now, let's start off by acknowledging that fact one is completely true and awarding Arthur full points for it. There is no doubt that Conan's intention is to ravish this woman, whether she likes it or not. Now, Arthur also tells us that there is no excuse possible for this story. But, in my opinion, there are actually many simple, very obvious explanations for it. So, let's start with the small stuff and work our way up. If you read a book in which some kind of crime takes place, does that mean that you yourself have committed that crime by proxy? Or does that mean that you yourself support that crime? Let's even go to a more interactive form of media, like video games. Every time you play a game in which the character you are directly controlling murders someone, does that mean that you yourself are a murderer or support murder? I'm looking for a clear yes or no answer. If you watch a movie or play a game in which a woman gets raped, does that mean that you are a real-life rapist? Or that you support the real-life crime of rape? Because if it does, then you may as well just keep to the children's section for the rest of your life, because rape and murder happen all the time in the world of fiction, and if simply looking at it is a crime, I don't believe there's an adult human alive who isn't guilty of it. Now, you may want to jump to the extreme example of child pornography or bestiality or some such where possession of it is a crime, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about perfectly legal, mass-produced fiction. All fiction really is the world of fantasy, the world of theory. There is no Conan, and never has been or never will be. All we are really doing is moving around imaginary chess pieces and playing a theoretical chess game that never happened. And while those chess games have the ability to affect a person emotionally, in fact, they're largely about evoking an emotional response, there really is a limit to how seriously they should be taken, and how much we should freak out about them in the real world. Now, let's address something that I think is vitally important to this whole issue, and that is comparing the crime of rape to the crime of murder. I've not done a survey myself, but I think that if I did do a survey and ask people which they thought was worse, rape or murder, I would get, well, I don't know, maybe half and half? Or hell, maybe there would be a majority saying that rape is worse. I don't know, I can only imagine. But what I do believe is that on clear inspection, there's no question about it. Murder is a much worse crime than rape. Now let me explain why. If you listen to the feminist rhetoric that surrounds rape, they will often say that rape is worse than murder because it inflicts mental scars which are harder to heal than physical scars. There is truth to that argument. I agree completely that generally mental scars are harder to heal than physical because it can mean confronting what it is that harmed you. However, that does not mean that they cannot heal or lose their sting over time. No matter what the rhetoric says about rape, the fact is it's not a one-size-fits-all crime. There are varying degrees of damage inflicted by sexual assault or an attempted sexual assault. Again, we're playing the game of politics when we lose our willingness to judge matters on a case-by-case basis and find the truth to each story. Now, setting aside the rhetoric that might have you believe that every time a woman gets raped, she is doomed to spend the rest of her life shivering in a corner, let me ask you honestly, have you ever seen that? Have you ever in your life met a person, man or woman, who after being sexually assaulted, lost the ability to function as a normal human and spent the rest of their life in a mental institution? All I can speak from is my own experience, and I've met many people, many of them in my family or otherwise close to me, and I suspect that feminists are correct when they say that the crime of rape is underreported. And so there are likely many others that I know who I don't know have been sexually abused. Yet for all of those that I know who were, not one of them, men or women, have lost the ability or willingness to laugh, lost the ability to smile, lost the ability to heal and move on. To a man, to a woman, every single one of them has found a way to move on with their lives, and almost every one is either married and has children, or has found a partner to share their life with. I've never met, or even heard second or third hand about a person who suffered sexual assault and spent their life shivering in a corner. Now, that's not to say that they aren't out there just because I haven't met any, but it is to say that rape is not a guaranteed, one-way ticket to the end of happiness. There are many examples of famous people who have suffered rape or sexual assault and have gone on to live happy, successful lives doing something on a world-class level. And of course, there is the feminist counter-argument, you're just a man, your opinion on rape means nothing. An argument which ignores the fact that men also get raped and sexually abused. But, okay, that's true, that's right, I've never been raped. However, there are those with a lot more street cred on the subject than me who feel the same way.
It's not murder, because murder, you're dead, you're gone, who cares, whatever. It's not anything else. Rape leaves somebody scarred for life, and in my personal opinion, it is worse than murder, because that person has to live with what has happened to them forever.
I wanted to speak to something you said earlier, because I'm going to take a very little bit of issue with it, and this is personal experience. This is about rape being worse than murder. I don't agree. It's not. It's not worse than murder. It's looked at as a worse crime than murder. But personally, I've been suffocated to death by my own body with asthma attacks, and actually had to have a needle to the chest. And I've looked down the barrel of a gun in the past, and rape is not worse than murder. I've experienced that as well, and I would really rather not die again. And if I had the choice between the two, I would choose rape. I don't want to die before my time. I got things I want to get done, and frankly, the last time it kind of hurt. The problem with it is, and I know there are women who have been taught to be so traumatized by the experience that they freak out forever and never recover emotionally from it. But that's a social thing, not a it's not a naturally occurring thing. We are not naturally that wimpy. We can get talked into it, and people do get talked into it. And the problem with all of that is that we've allowed public opinion, that specific public opinion, to determine how we as a society treat the crime.
Murder, on the other hand, is an ironclad, 100% guarantee to the end of happiness, the end of healing, the end of growth, and the end of communication. When you've murdered someone, you've taken away so much more than the carnal knowledge of their body. You've taken away years of potential. Years, likely several decades of possibilities. You've taken away what I personally believe is the single greatest and simplest joy in life that anybody, even if they're not a famous movie star or rock star, can access, and that is the ability to watch their children grow, to watch their grandchildren grow. You've taken away all of their potential decades of get-togethers with family, their Christmases, their birthdays, their favorite movies. No matter who you are or how bad your life is, everyone has something in it which makes them happy. Murder robs them of all of it. It even robs the murderer of the chance to apologize, even if they sincerely come to regret their actions. That door is closed forever. It is not case by case like rape. It is always case closed. If I ever had to choose either or, even on my worst enemy, and I was somehow forced to come face to face with which I truly deem to be the lesser of two clear evils, all I could ever say is, at least let them have the chance to heal. At least give them the possibility to recover. So why all this talk about rape and murder? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? At this point, I want to thank and acknowledge the great work by the members of the Dark Horse comic staff, because their Conan series tells many of the Howard classics perfectly in comic book form. They're beautifully well drawn, and tell the story with the same events, pace, and timing as the original stories, so it gives a quick, clear reference for the story as a whole. The Frost Giant's Daughter is a 22-page comic, and Arthur, the sum total of your criticism, the reason that you assert the story is vile and reprehensible, is found on page 17 and 18. A frightened Atali, whose plans to murder Conan blew up in her face, desperately tries to get away and calls on her divine father to save her. Your criticism is a moral criticism. You say, who really wants to read anything this ugly and seedy? So, let me ask you something, Arthur. Does this bother you? Here we have a broadsword being punched through the heart of a fully aware man in the prime of his life. Does this bother you? Decapitated heads, bodies riddled with arrows, stabbed and already turning blue from the cold. Unlike the uncompleted crime of rape of Atali, these crimes were committed, and we can see clear evidence, and it raises zero hackles of morality on your part. So again, does this bother you? You and I both know that the answer is no, it doesn't. It gets your blood racing. It gets mine too. Men and women do have differences and different tendencies, but we are both the same species, both human, and essentially more alike than different. Men and women tend to like different genres of books. We both like reading books. Men and women tend to like different kinds of movies. We both enjoy watching movies. Unlike all other animals, when we hear a funny joke, we both laugh. When we read a great story, we both feel inspired. And when you jam a broadsword down our throat, we both feel excruciating pain before we both die. And yet, that doesn't bother you. That doesn't bother anyone. Because, let's be perfectly honest with ourselves. You wouldn't be reading it if no one was getting violently murdered, would you? If the title of the story was Conan the Librarian, about a pudgy middle-aged man who lives with his mom and 3 cats and works part-time at the library, you wouldn't give a shit about it, would you? Yeah, neither would I. But wait a minute, guy. Those rapes are much worse because it's unfair. It's a big, muscular guy against a weaker woman. Right. Unfair. Kind of like 2 large frost giants, both of whom are larger and stronger against one mortal. But hey, it's fine if Conan kills people. Conan only kills people in war, or bad guys that try to attack him first. That's a fair point. Let's come back to that later. Now again, I was poking around online and I found this article, a little old, 2008, but it was about a guy who did us the favor of counting up the numbers of deaths and sex in the Dark Horse Conan series. What does he say? I thought of a project to track deaths in comics, and because Conan gets laid quite a bit, why not track sex too? This goes back to American squeamishness about sex, but acceptance of bloody violence I've occasionally ranted about here. Good show! I like you already, Mr. Greg Burgas. Now, our friend Greg here has done us the favor of giving us some numbers to play with, which are individual issue and cumulative. For example, issue number 1. Deaths in this issue, 5. Probably, definitely 4. He's referring to the fact that Conan cuts a man's arm off, and he will probably die. Total deaths, 13. Number of people Conan kills, 3. Total number of people Conan has killed, 11. Beheadings, 1. Total beheadings, 3. So, let's just skip down to the grand total, shall we? And we see that, of 50 total issues, number of sentient beings that die or are killed, 410. Average per comic, 8.2. Number of sentient beings that Conan kills, 179. Average per comic, 3.58. And it doesn't say here, but total beheadings, 20. Number of sex acts seen or heavily implied, 12. Average per comic, 0.24. Number of times Conan gets lucky, 10. Average per comic, 0.2. 1 for every 5 issues. Yes, Conan cuts off men's heads in full view twice as often as he has consensual, off-screen sex with women. And he just flat out kills them something like 18 times more. Does that bother you? If not, remember, I could use feminist logic and call you a murder apologist, and say that you are contributing to murder culture by belittling and trivializing the act. Now, you might be saying that this is only the comic version, which took some liberties with the source material, and you would be right. These numbers just give you an idea. The numbers would be a little bit different if we took into account the original stories, but the tendencies wouldn't change at all. It is well known that Conan has always been much more red-handed than blue-balled. Arthur, I think that your imbalanced moral outrage is definitely influenced by feminism. You had to have been told by someone, or many someones repeatedly, that any crime visited upon a woman is completely unacceptable, in order to become so sensitive to that, and at the same time completely insensitive to another crime just as bad, or in fact I would argue worse, which happens with a hell of a lot more frequency and graphic detail. Because we're still just playing theoretical chess. I think that if both crimes happen right in front of you, if you saw a rape face to face, or if you saw someone ran through the heart with a sword, they would both leave you feeling equally as horrified. When feminists complain that women are objectified in the world of fiction, they are absolutely right. Look at these women. Do they strike you as particularly real, actual people? Do you think they have names, wants, dreams? Well, no. They're essentially just decorations. They are just to imply the power and status of this man. The problem with the feminist claim of objectification is that it subtly seems to imply that it only happens to women. Kind of like when a car advertisement tells you how elegant and efficient their car is, implying that the competition's car isn't, even when both cars are essentially the same. Look at these identically drawn men. Do they strike you as particularly real, actual people? Do they have names, motivations, dreams? No. They're just decorations. Just there to die in waves to make the hero or villain look like a badass. Why is this a problem that requires immediate corrective action, but this isn't even really worth mentioning? And that brings us to political correctness. As I said before, it seems to go hand in hand with feminism. Both are essentially socially unassailable and immensely influential, and both are at heart one-sided and ultimately hypocritical. Political correctness is like the whitewashing paint we use to cover up our human flaws. It doesn't mean that the flaws are not there anymore. It doesn't bring us to any closer or more meaningful understanding of our nature. It just punishes the outward manifestations of those flaws. So if Donald Sterling was smart enough to keep his fool mouth shut, keep on his nice formal suit, keep himself covered in white paint when the cameras were rolling, he could have gone on through his life being thought of as just a kindly old man. Instead, we take away his team, make him pay a fine, and act like that has any effect on his actual heart. We don't like to admit it, but the truth is we humans are stimulated by sexuality and violence. And that's not always the pretty side of our nature, but it is real and it is always there. And even if you want to wear your best formal suit and cover yourself in white paint, underneath all of that, from the day you were born to the day you die, is your imperfect human mind, your imperfect human heart, and your sexual organs. And they will be there long after you take off that suit, and that white paint flakes off and washes away. Feminism might want us to worship women as if they were goddesses and angels, and apologize simply for being men, and some men might take them up on it, like the conscious men.
Dear woman, we stand before you today as men committed to becoming more conscious in every way.
We feel deep love, great respect, and a growing sense of worship for the gifts of the feminine. We also feel deep sorrow about the destructive actions of the unconscious masculine in the past and present.
We want to apologize and make amends for those actions today, so that we can move forward together into a new era of co-creation.
Throughout history, men have raped and abused you, burned you at the stake, bought and sold your bodies for sexual pleasure.
On behalf of my gender, I apologize to you
for our unconscious actions when we were angry, scared, and in the grip of destructive forces in our psyche.
But let me ask you another honest question. You have on one side, theoretically, everything that feminists say they want. A man who is willing to worship them and say that everything is his fault. And on the other, you have an arrogant but rich, famous, muscular young man who is known for physically beating a woman. Which of these two do you think more women would choose as a potential partner? Which of these two has no trouble at all finding a woman for whatever he desires, dating, marriage, casual sex, or just companionship? While I will say that most of the women in my life are very nice and kind-hearted people, women are not goddesses to be worshipped. They're not perfect angels floating above the rest of mankind. I'm married to one. Even though I love her very much, I can assure you that women do burp, they do fart, they do make mistakes, they do get bad thoughts in their head, and they do bad actions. They are every bit as human as men. Now, political correctness doesn't solve the problem of racism because it doesn't really give a shit about racism. I'll say that again. Political correctness doesn't really give a shit at all about racism. What does it care about? Well, it says so in the name, doesn't it? Political correctness is about politics, about offending the smallest number of people. It doesn't seek to come to an understanding about the reality of human nature. It just wants to sweep the uglier elements of it under the rug. Don't believe you can get away with racism in a PC culture? It's easy, really. Just go to any public forum, get behind a microphone, and say something like, "Black people are such good dancers. They've got rhythm. Latinos, they're so fiery and passionate. Asians, wow, they're so good at math. White people, they're all assholes." Say that, and no hashtag activist will accuse you of racism. Even though you are exhibiting the textbook definition of racism, you are categorizing and assigning qualities to a group of people based on nothing but race and ethnicity. Remember our good friend Sui Park, the Korean-American activist who became famous for promoting the hashtag #CancelColbert, ironically over a satirical tweet that Stephen Colbert didn't even make? She thought the tweet, even though it was poking fun at Daniel Snyder, the owner of the Redskins, was racist, and defended her point by using racism.
I really don't think that we're going to end racism by joking about it. Like, I'm glad that the white liberals feel like they are less racist because they can joke about people that are more explicitly racist, but that actually does nothing to help people of color. Yeah, I was going to say that I feel like it's incredibly patronizing for you to paint these questions this way, especially as a white man. I don't expect you to be able to understand what people of color are actually saying with regards to cancel Colbert.
Now again, like feminism, she's not entirely without a point. It is arguably harder for a person of one race to fully understand the problems of another. But when she says, you can't do something because of the color of your skin, she's exhibiting the exact quality that she's supposedly fighting against. And when she sends out the tweet, racism and whiteness go together, only white people can be racist, she's demonstrating an epic level of hypocrisy. She's locked into her politics, and she doesn't really care about the specifics. Now, that was part of the beauty of Conan, because he was exactly the opposite of politically correct. He didn't give a shit about politics, or feminism, or focus groups, or hashtags. He didn't worship women just because they were women. He judged things on an individual basis, and even though he was brusque and brutal, he was honest. He treated bad men and women badly, and he treated friendly men and women well. And even though he said racist things about blacks, to use an overused phrase, he had black friends. In his pirate days, his black Kushite crew affectionately called him Amra the Lion, and it might irk you that Conan kind of instantly came in and became their leader, i.e. white man should naturally control black men, but the fact is Conan is always in the leadership role, leading up to being king by his own hand. And when he meets his old black companions, he treats them like humans. He knows their names. He sees them as individuals. In other words, he doesn't hate all black people just because they are black, and think of them as subhuman monkeys or cockroaches. It is true that the author often made black people antagonistic, but Conan was still just being Conan. Now, let's talk a little bit more about racism. Growing up in the 1980s, one of my favorite things to watch, to this very day, is the old Disney Donald, Mickey, and Goofy shorts, and later the TV show DuckTales, which was based on the old Karl Barks comics, both of which were largely made in the 1940s and 50s. And even as such, they, media made for children's entertainment, contain many examples of racism. And I'm not even talking about Anita Sarkeesian-style, nitpicky, reading too much into it racism. I'm talking about purposefully sent racist messages. I'm talking about very racist and belittling character models. I'm talking about offensive and demeaning accents. I'm talking about my beloved Donald Duck using the phrase slant-eyed nips. Now, if I wanted to, I'm well within my rights to get righteously upset and throw it all in the garbage like the Conan stories. But wait, you can't compare those things. They're totally different. Right, they're different. Conan is about a wandering adventurer who goes to several different countries in the course of his journeying. Meeting and interacting with different peoples, different ethnicities, different races is essentially bound to happen. This need never enter a children's story, but that's how ubiquitous and casual this kind of racism was at the time. In fact, the Bark stories in many of the shorts came about a decade after Howard's death. So we can look at something like this and thumb our noses at it and say how wrong the people of that time were, but we're not really learning anything about human nature, are we? What we're really doing is we're being like a typical potser who logs on to a chess forum and uses his supercomputer to analyze the mistakes in a game that was played centuries ago and laugh at how bad those players were. Well, yeah, it's easy to laugh at a game played in 1789 or 1620 and call it nonsense when you have a software program on your computer that could give God a run for his money, telling you the right answers. We might not like to admit it, but if you are white, and you live in an environment that is almost all white, your friends and family are white, and there is no social condemnation for using the word nigger to describe black people, in fact, everyone else around you does it, the chances are you're probably going to do it too. Now, we know these days more clearly that it isn't a good thing to do, but it isn't unnatural to do what everyone around you does. We can look at this, or this, and point the righteous finger. But the last time America was in a war, nobody told us to tighten our belts, buy war bonds, and do everything as an individual to help the war effort. There's something very silly to me about not being able to take something from the past and apply that grain of salt and just let it go, especially if there is a good side to it. I'm black, I'm African American, and this doesn't bother me at all. My wife is Japanese. This doesn't bother her at all. The current year is 2015, and even with our supercomputer technology, we still fuck it up when it comes to racism. And we're still going to fuck it up in 3015. Now, does that mean that we have to like Howard? And we have to sit through the racism if it bothers us? Well, no. That's a pretty silly conclusion to jump to. You can like or dislike whatever the hell you want to. All I'm really trying to demonstrate is that there are very simple reasons that anyone, even a person of color and apt to feel more sensitive to racism, can just let it go. Why is it that anybody in our super advanced PC society can defend this? I wonder why. Now, I could step into the very simple trap and say that everyone defends her because, well, she's pretty. But that's not quite true. Fortunately, there are most who judge her on the merits and demerits of her argument, like the interviewer she was talking to.
As a white man, I don't expect you to be able to understand what people of color are actually saying with regards to cancel Colbert. He has a history of making jokes.
Sorry, being a white man doesn't prevent me from being able to think and doesn't prevent me from being able to have reasoned perspectives on things. I didn't give up my right to be able to have an intellectual conversation when I was born.
I know, but
and people who responded to her tweets. I'm sorry, I know this is hard to read. This is the best quality image I could find. She says, "Happy Halloween. I would dress up this year, but white supremacy and patriarchy already give me the creeps. Please give out less candy to the kids in racist costumes." To which some mockingly replied, "This year for Halloween, I just sat home and felt bad for being born white. Methinks you see racism in everything," and "Sui Park is a racist bigot." So not everybody defends her or automatically sides with her, but her argument is so obviously flawed that I think, yes, there are some people who do. There are some people who would defend her for the comically ironic reason that she doesn't look like a bad guy. She doesn't look like a racist. Some will take her side because she looks like a beautiful young lady. Speaking of which, Now it's time to head into Endgame, Arthur, and recall a few points, and tell you what it is about your analysis that bothers me the most, and that is the deception. Remember when Conan said he would never leave a white woman in the clutches of a black man? He followed that up by saying, "I never forced a woman against her consent." Your response to that was, set aside for a moment Conan's claim that he has never raped anyone, because we know from the Frost Giant's daughter that this is purely a competence issue as opposed to being a matter of ethics. Bullshit! That statement is pure intellectual garbage, and I sweep it right off the table. I do not accept that statement from a person as knowledgeable as you, Arthur. Why? Number one, we were never going to see Atali get raped. That was never in the cards. Remember the editor I showed before where a reader complained about a rape scene? I was proud of the editor because he stood his ground and pointed out correctly that while rapes happen in the Conan series, they were never depicted graphically. They always happened off camera. I might even be on your side if at the end of the story it goes into a graphic sequence where Conan is leering down at her and licking her face and forcing her legs apart while she's screaming in terror. Then the word vile could be appropriate, but that was never going to happen. In the Conan books, men's heads are chopped off, they are peppered with arrows, sliced into ribbons, on camera, in full HD. Rapes, and even consensual sex, always happens where no one can see. The editor knows that, I know that, and Arthur, you absolutely know that. Number two, there's a very simple reason that Conan is doggedly chasing Atali. The story is modeled on the Greek myth of Apollo and Daphne, where Apollo is so obsessed after being hit with Cupid's arrow that he chases her until she calls on her father, who is a god, to help her, and he turns her into a laurel tree. In this story, our Cupid's arrow was Atali's supernatural beauty. Listen to this description, which also points to Howard's acumen as a writer. His gaze went again to her unruly locks, which at first glance he had thought to be red. Now he saw that they were neither red nor yellow, but a glorious compound of both colors. He gazed spellbound. Her hair was like elfin gold. The sun struck it so dazzlingly that he could scarcely bear to look upon it. Her eyes were likewise neither wholly blue nor wholly gray, but of shifting colors, and dancing lights, and clouds of colors he could not define. Her full red lips smiled, and from her slender feet to the blinding crown of her billowy hair, her ivory body was as perfect as the dream of a god. Conan's pulse hammered in his temples. Atali doesn't look like her brothers. She doesn't look like mortal women. Her beauty is a plot device. You are a person of literature, Arthur. You absolutely know what a plot device is. You know that it makes a character do things they otherwise wouldn't do so that they can complete the author's intended story arc. Atali's enchanting beauty causes madness in men. How do we know? Because the author keeps saying so. At the end of the story, Conan says, "A strange madness fell upon me when I looked at her, so I forgot all else in the world." Now, you might not like that explanation. To you, that might sound like, wave your ass around and you get more than you bargained for, but you're oversimplifying. Because most women who go to a party and shake that ass around don't have access to a love potion, and aren't on a mission to lead a man into an ambush where her two hulking brothers cut his heart out. Remember when we said that stabbing people with broadswords is wrong, but we had an explanation, i.e. those were bad people threatening Conan? Well, Conan is doing something wrong again, and we have a simple explanation for his behavior. So why can we not let it go in this case? Number 3, Conan is simply not a rapist. You know that, I know that, and all the fans know that. I might understand that misinterpretation from an amateur. You are not an amateur to the subject. I do not accept that attitude from you. To get to the erroneous conclusion that Conan is a rapist, you have to ignore the fact the one time he tried to, he wasn't acting in character. You have to ignore the fact that he never does it in any other story. Even the times that he saves a woman who basically says, "You saved me, big boy, I'll do whatever you want." And you especially have to ignore the fact that it is very much in character for Conan to leap into action instantly when a woman is in danger, and that he will typically put himself directly between a woman and danger. He doesn't necessarily do that for men, even good men. Conan is a rapist? My ass he is. Fourscore men lying dead in the snow means nothing. One frightened woman means everything. When you boil it down to simply penis versus vagina, you lose everything that the story was about. No matter how you slice it, Atali is the bad guy of the story. Unlike Conan, she is acting very well within character. She is sober and clear-headed, and her known goal is to cut Conan's heart out to present it to her father. Are we supposed to deny that because she's beautiful? Because she doesn't look like a bad guy? Why would someone go so far out of their way to paint a picture they know is false, unless they were informed by an ideology that told them that only one gender's concerns really mattered? Ironically, by an ideology that claims it is about equality. But really it isn't. Feminism is not about holding women fully accountable for their mistakes. Why would someone be so eager to put the screws to a guilty man, and be so willing to let a guiltier woman completely off the hook, unless they were influenced by an imbalanced, one-sided philosophy? Now, Arthur, both you and Sheeman mentioned the term feminist brainwashing in regards to my comments. It's a fair point, so I'll quickly address it. To be clear, I don't think that feminists strap you to a chair and shove their ideas down your throat a Clockwork Orange style. I don't think it really works like that. I learned something in my 5 years that I spent overseas in Japan, when I suddenly caught myself unconsciously bowing to people, even when talking on the phone. I basically learned that culture is something like a tide that washes over you, and whether you want it to or not, or whether you realize it or not, it pulls you in certain directions, and makes certain ideas and actions seem normal. Do you understand what I mean by that? Now that tide can be fought against, and sometimes should be fought against, but it comes down to understanding human nature. Your analysis of the Frost Giant's daughter, and Conan in general, is peppered throughout with this kind of glib intolerance for the bad side of human nature that you, and I, and everyone share. Now bear in mind, there is a lot more that I wanted to say. I could have spent another hour talking about this section alone, but we'll leave it at this for now. If you'd like to mount a rebuttal, please. I'd like to hear it. I want you to explain to me again why these 2 pages are enough to throw an interesting and well-written story in the trash. I want to hear your thoughts on the crime of rape versus the crime of murder, i.e., why does attempted rape not only trump attempted murder, but it trumps it to the point that we don't even need seriously consider it. I want you to explain to me how Conan is not the primary victim of the story, just because he's a strong man, and how Atali is not the villain of the story, just because she's a beautiful woman. What I'm looking for are intelligent and well-considered arguments. If you want me to eat your humble pie, then your recipe needs to leave out the lumps of bullshit. So if you use any feministy, get-out-of-jail-free cards like, you're a meanie head and I don't have to listen to you, or it's my morality, I can believe whatever I want. Remember, I'm not challenging your right to have your own opinion. What I'm basically saying is, your stance is hypocritical, this is why I think it's hypocritical, prove me wrong. Any argument on your part that deflects, or tries to get around, or does anything but address my arguments head-on, will be interpreted by me as your tacit admission that you couldn't do it on intellectual merit alone. And if you really take the feminist jump off into the illogical deep end, and say something like, well, obviously you hate women, or clearly you support rape, you like rape, then not only will I crassly throw up my hands in victory, but I will happily tell you to kiss my notably stubborn equine pack animal. Yes, Shimin, I have heard of feminism. I don't like it.